Welcome to In Conversation. I'm John Rees. Today I'm very pleased to be in conversation with Howard Tucker. Howard is a former South Wales police detective who became head of mission for the UN International Criminal Tribunal in Bosnia. In that post, he was responsible for work that brought to court the leading perpetrators of the genocide committed against Bosnian Muslims in the Balkan War of 1992-1995. That war killed 14,000 people, 80% of them Muslims. Some 8,000 of those deaths took place in the 1995 Srebrenica massacre, an event designated as a genocide by the International Court in The Hague. Howard Tucker investigated those war crimes and helped bring those responsible, including Serb General Ratko Mladic and wartime leader Radovan Karadzic, to justice. Howard, welcome to the programme.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here.
So what was it that got you from the South Wales police to investigating war crimes in the Balkans?
It's quite an interesting story, John, to be honest. I mean, at the time of the Balkans War, like many people in the UK, I was fascinated and horrified by the developments that were on our screen. Excuse me. And one evening I was at home watching the news and saw the image of Colonel Bob Stewart, who was the commander of the British forces in central Bosnia under the UN flag. He was on the 16th of April, 1993. I remember the date very well. And he was standing in front of a burning village called Amici. And this village of Amici was a predominantly Muslim village that had been attacked in the early hours of that morning by the Bosnian Croat military army, the paramilitary groups, who forcibly evicted the Muslim population, killing 120 people in the process, men, women and children. And he was standing outraged in front of, I can see it in my mind's eye now, the burning buildings of Amici. And you could see the bodies of civilians lying on the ground in the distance. And he was outraged. He was saying that as far as he was concerned, war crimes would be committed there and then. Now, bear in mind, this is 2.5 years before Srebrenica, and this is Bosnian Croats against Bosnian Muslims. But he said war crimes are taking place here. And he's almost demanding that there should be an independent tribunal to investigate the atrocities. And I remember turning to my wife and saying something like, well, if they do establish a tribunal, they'll be seeking experienced investigators. And if they do, put you on notice now, well, I'll be applying. You know, half humour, half not, because I wasn't convinced that I would ever be able to get on there, even if it did take place. But sure enough, a few years later, I responded to an advert in our local police magazine, which was inviting applicants for a secondment for International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. Cut a long story short, I applied for it, and after several months I was a successful candidate and went on a 12-month secondment to the ICTY. And I was put on an investigation team that was investigating crimes in central Bosnia. And actually, the crime that I was given was the attack on the village of Amici, the very one I'd seen on the news a few years before. So it was quite an amazing event in many ways.
And just describe, what were the differences? Because I imagine they must have been huge between the kind of duties that you were carrying out in South Wales and the kind of things that you were required to do in your new job.
Well, the main thing was it was the crimes you were investigating. As a detective in division, I investigate everything from thefts of handbags to assaults and burglaries, domestic and commercial, and all the arrays of crimes up to and including murder and rape and kidnapping. But in those instances, I was a member of a team of maybe 100 investigators, so it was different on the scale of things. And of course, once I was with the tribunal, we were only looking at murder, torture, destruction of property, etc. So it was the focus of the crimes and the scale of the crimes that we were looking at.
And how did that actually take place? Because I mean, I guess most people thinking of a sort of war crime like that, and as you say, seeing those pictures on the television, I guess they would perhaps think that it's a relatively kind of open and shut case. You can see it happening in front of you. How much kind of investigation is there, and what's the point of the investigation? What are you establishing when it's a kind of open war situation like that?
You're right in one context. When you see the images, it seems it's open and shut case. You see the destruction of property, you see civilians lying in the street. Vis-a-vis, it must be murder and mayhem. But actually, there's ways in the conduct of where civilians can be killed. I'm not saying legitimately, but it can be a natural cause of warfare and not be a war crime. It's the way that the individuals are dealt with and how they're killed, captured, tortured is the essence of it. So your first thing, to simplify it, the approach is no different to any domestic crime. You have to establish a crime base. And what's a crime base? A crime base is the location where a particular crime took place, but you then have to establish, well, what crime is it? Is it just destruction of property? Is it kidnapping? Is it torture? Is it rape? Is it murder? Or is it all of the above? Because it might appear to be apparent on the newsreels, but it's not. Because you have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt in a criminal court that these offences have taken place and that those that you suspect of the crimes are responsible.
And the crime specifically has to be not simply that civilians are, in that absolutely awful phrase, collateral damage, but that there is an intentionality to kill civilians as a method of war. That's what you're dealing with.
Or a disregard for the laws and customs of war, if I can simplify it like that, a breach of the various Geneva Conventions.
And when you got to work, how different was what you found on the ground than perhaps you'd imagined it? Was this kind of conduct more widespread, more prevalent than you thought it would be?
That's a very good question. I mean, I went over there fairly open-minded because I think you would understand. I understood that there were going to be things I'd seen which I'd never come across. I'd seen a shotgun instance where people had been shot with shotguns, but I'd never seen a firearms injury per se. I'd never seen somebody blown up by a bomb or a hand grenade. I'd never seen destruction of buildings by shelling. So on that context, it's totally different. But I had been to murders. I had seen dead people. I had seen destruction of buildings through fire or other incidents. So it's the scale and the intentional damage is different, and trying to get accustomed to that idea.
And kind of the surrounding context of war, of course, very different, especially one in which there's ethnically based killing, very different from any domestic crime you're liable to encounter. So was it a very steep learning curve, not only about this kind of scale of the crimes that you were witnessing, but the contextual politics and the politics of war?
All of it, all of the above. Excuse me, without trying to generalise the question, John. As an investigator from the UK, you had to consider the cultural issues, even before you start talking to witnesses or suspects. You had to think about those. You had to think about the politics at the time, what caused the war, who were the warring factions. It's very complicated in Bosnia. There's, as you know, there's Bosnian Serbs, Muslims, and Croats. There's three different elements in their main elements, all with their political motives. A new regime, because it came out of a one-party communist state. And so they only declared independence in 1992, and that was by a majority of the Muslims and the Croats. The Bosnian Serbs refused to participate. So you had a very complicated political background. But the underlying issue was that we know the war was started by Milosevic with their invasion of Slovenia, which didn't last long. Then they attacked Croatia, a nasty war with Croatia, and it overspilled into Bosnia in 1993. And so you had to be aware of all these different factions, and before you start really investigating, you had to become familiar with what is the root cause of it before you can even start to consider what the crime base was. Because how can you establish what crimes have taken place if you don't know who the warring factions are, the likely culprits, and the motivation and the crimes that are committed? So it's very complicated.
So what would the process be? There's a suspected war crime has taken place. Obviously, you'd be talking to the victims and witnesses. In a domestic case, I guess you'd also then be talking to people who were accused, but
eventually, yes.
Of course, that must have been a very different circumstance.
Extremely different, especially when you start talking about Srebrenica. The main perpetrators, as we know, went on the run. We had a lot of difficulty. Milosevic, for example, we know was arrested, handed over by the Serbian officials, but he died in custody. But Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic were on the run for 15 years. And we didn't know where they were, had suspicions, but that didn't stop you from investigating the crime. You still had to build up your evidence against them. And initially, I mean, genocide was always on the books, but we didn't know that genocide. You don't know that genocide has taken place until you've done the groundwork. And you suddenly realise, well, hang on, these crimes don't fit in just to the crimes against humanity and the war crimes against the Geneva Conventions. This is an actual attempt to eradicate a body of people because of who they are, and that's a long process.
And what would be the mechanism? You do the investigative work, you reach a conclusion. What was the bureaucracy involved? Where did that go? Who was supposed to action that? I mean, you know, obviously in this country, the police make a case, it goes to the Crown Prosecutional Service, But what happens in international affairs?
Well, that's also a very good question, very interesting question. The ICGY was an ad hoc UN institution. It had never been done before, never had a body that was responsible for investigating and prosecuting crimes of this nature. So it was a brand new baby. It started in 1993. And so it had to develop its own rules and regulations. It had to develop its own case. There's no case law. Case law, for the benefit of the viewers, is something where there's already been a case that's been tried and prosecuted and gone to appeal, and whatever that case has been determined, that becomes a case law that can be referred to in future cases. There was none of that. None of that, apart from the war crimes after the Second World War. And so it was a brand new baby, so they had to develop their own. So basically, cut a long story short, there were numerous investigative teams. I think there was 11 at the height, and each one was responsible for investigating a certain part of the alleged crime base within the whole of the Balkan area. Excuse me. And then within that, each team, it depends on the size of the team, that would be subdivided into particular areas of the area of responsibility. And just to try to simplify it for you, when I went to the crime tribunal in the first case, our crimes were in central Bosnia. So whatever happened in the rest of the area, we weren't involved in those investigations, just in central Bosnia. But central Bosnia is quite a big area, and there are a number of particular areas of violence, extreme violence, that would fit into what we were investigating. So the team would be subdivided to look at those individual pots, but of course they would all have one area of a commander, if you like, in charge, and his subordinates below them. And eventually, quite some years after I joined the tribunal, the prosecutors decided to only concentrate on the mid and high level perpetrators. So you were going for the mid and high level. So you had to develop the crime base, and that is, it sounds simple to do, but okay, you might be told, you look at how many complaints you have, about a particular incident, but you go there and you try to interview people, search military archives, political archives, and build up as much of a picture of what went on in that ground as you can. And as you receive those complaints and those witness statements, you eventually analyse them and try to work out what has taken place, what crimes have been committed, where and how and by whom, and if they're all linked. And then you start your step-by-step to try to find the way up the ladder. And it's the crime base, it's no different to what you do on a domestic arena, but on a much larger scale.
And so when that work was concluded and you were sort of satisfied that you had an accurate picture, or as accurate as it could be, of who had done what.
Yes.
Where would that go for further? What would be the further action, and who would be taking the further action?
The investigative team would include lawyers as well as part of the investigating team. Once there was sufficient information that the senior trial attorney on your team, that's the one who would be prosecuting in court, agreed or decided there was sufficient evidence, he would discuss it with the prosecutor and then submit the papers for that, if you like, against yourself, to the courts and say, we would like an international arrest warrant for this individual. The judge on that would look at the evidence and decide if there was sufficient, and if there was, he would issue an international arrest warrant for the suspect. Now, we weren't a police force. We had no police as such. We had to rely on the local jurisdictions for their support. But of course, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the police force was quite often the suspected perpetrators. So we had to rely on other sources like military assistance there to conduct our arrests for us if we found them. They assisted with searches.
So that would be UN troops?
UN troops, either from U4 or NATO or a combination of both, who were all resident in situ as the peacekeeping forces in the area. So it was quite a complicated process, quite a long, drawn-out process. And of course, you can only arrest somebody if you know where he is. And the main perpetrators knew that the jig was up, if I can say it, and they went on the run and were Mladic and Karadzic were on the run for 15 years before they were arrested. But it didn't stop the investigations going on. And behind all what I discussed is when we became aware that there were a lot of people who were murdered and buried in mass graves, that wasn't the team that I was initially working on. Those teams, if you like, the Srebrenica teams, were looking in earnest for these graves because we knew there were thousands of people killed, but we didn't know where. We had all these, some survivor, we had some survivors from executions who told that, that they'd survived executions amongst hundreds, if not thousands of individuals, but we had no idea where these individuals were. And so it was a great deal of work done on the ground by these investigative teams to try to find these mass graves, and they succeeded. But I don't think that, in fact, the Serbian perpetrators, Bosnian Serb perpetrators, I don't think really believed that we would ever get to the situation of be looking in earnest for these graves. So they didn't worry about them. But when they realised, well, actually, these guys are in earnest and they're getting close to finding these things, they dug up these mass graves. Now, some of these held 1,500 people. They dug them up with bulldozers and piled the remains on the backs of lorries and took them to secondary and tertiary graves and just dumped them in again, expecting.
And was that happening in real time when you were there?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And so, I mean, obviously there's a kind of second wave of crime taking place there. Did those people then fall within the remit of your investigation?
Yeah, and at that time, not mine, there was the other teams who were dealing with that. I mean, when I became head of office, I was actually facilitating those, assisting the teams with locating the mass graves and other issues. But yes, they were looking for it. And I can remember there was one big exhumation site which I wasn't involved with. It was called it was a place called Bronjevo Military Farm, where 1,500 people were lined up and shot. Literally, and that takes a lot of doing to kill 1,500 people. And they were all put in a mass grave very close by. By the time our guys got there, they found a couple of bits and pieces of bones there, but the majority had been dug up and deposited elsewhere. While I was head of office, I went to see a secondary exhumation of it, and they recovered, I can't remember how many victims, maybe 50 or 60, I can't remember exactly now. But they actually found bodies there that still had their blindfolds and ligatures on, wrist ties. And the forensic anthropologist who was there happened to be a Canadian lady. I asked her, can you link these with other mass graves? She said, well, I can tell you now, I was actually at Bronjevo Farm, and some of the victims we found in that grave that were still there had the same ligatures here because they were made from material. They were a particular type of floral material. She said, I will send them off to forensic, but I can tell you now, these are definitely from that grave. So a lot of wonderful experts are involved in this process.
Let me just ask you about that decision that you mentioned just now to go after the middle and higher ranking people. I mean, you can, I can understand, from a resources point of view, why that would happen. I can understand that it's almost the reverse of what you sometimes expect, that the people who are lower down get nabbed, but the people who are higher up get away. Didn't happen in this case. But I'm wondering whether or not for some of the victims that might have been a controversial decision, because the people who are actually pulling the trigger are getting away, even if the people who ordered them to do so are being caught. How did you feel about? How did they feel about that?
That's a great question, because I can tell you, I had one particular witness who said, what do I know about Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic? I don't know who they are, but I know who shot my husband. Why aren't you going for him? So you can imagine the anger. I try to portray some of the anger and frustration there. That's how they felt. They were really grateful that we were looking into this business, but they couldn't understand why we were going for these hierarchy. Who's going to look after the person who shot my husband? He didn't shoot my husband. So it was very, very difficult. They they accepted it later. All of them, without exception, accepted it. But it's still a fact that shooters, when I say shooters, I mean the person who pulled the triggers, are still walking the streets in the places where these people live. And quite often they'll see them and say, he was part of the execution of my husband and my son. Why is he still walking the streets? Can I evolve that a little bit more?
Of course.
I mean, the decision was a difficult decision to make. But the tribunal at that time, if I remember rightly, we had something like 6,500 cases to investigate. And when I say cases, these are allegations of crimes that have been taking place. Not just, some were just individuals, but quite a few were multiple killings. But we had, at the height, we only had 1,500 people, and they weren't all investigators. We had about 150 investigators and a similar number of lawyers on 11 teams. You only have to do the maths yourself to try to work out how you're going to look at those. And a lot of those were low-level perpetrators, the shooters, as we call them. Of course, they're low-hanging fruit, and they're always the easiest to get. And I think it was a very difficult but very courageous decision to make by the hierarchy, because we were a limited time scale. It was ad hoc. It wasn't going to last forever, and we had to request a budget annually. And of course, there were always questions asked: how long is this going to go on? I don't think the international community didn't realise how long it was going to take to investigate these crimes. There was always pressure to be able to fulfil our mandate in the time allocated while trying to investigate these crimes. So she made the decision to investigate mid and higher level perpetrators, but not to ignore what's taken place before, but to package all the crimes we had and categorise them into 3 categories and send them back to the local jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute with our, not participation, but oversight, to make sure they were doing it properly, because the government, the country was starting to evolve its own judicial process. They developed a new state court and a state prosecutor's office, and so they were handed back so they could investigate themselves. And they were sent back. A lot of work was done to categorise these as, you know, almost trial ready, some investigation, no investigation, 3 categories, A, B and C. 1, 2 and 3.
One last question, because you can hardly turn on the television news at the moment without renewed discussion about what is genocide, what isn't genocide.
Absolutely.
Events in Gaza very forcefully in people's
Yes.
minds. You're watching that news the same
Yes.
as the rest of us. What's your reaction? Do you feel that not enough was learnt? Or do you feel that some of the kind of political authority that went into the prosecutions in Bosnia isn't really working in other places? What is your reaction to all that?
I've got quite a strong view in some ways. One of the international reaction about the success of the tribunal, the ICTY, it had its problems, but it was successful. I'm using the generic we. There was some ground-breaking legislation and court results in that case, which showed the world that you can prosecute people of higher placement. They don't have impunity, and they can be got. And I think the international community generally thought, we can't let this die. We've got to create an independent court, which they've done with the ICJ. Their own statute had all these signatures, and it's up and running. And that is running. Yes, it has flaws and problems, but it is an independent investigative body, and they've already issued arrest warrants for Palestine, for Gaza, and for Ukraine. We should respect that and understand that they can't comment on their ongoing investigations. They have issued warrants, which is extremely brave, which suggests to me that they're active investigations. They can't give an update on what's going on, the same as they can't here. It's an ongoing investigation. We can't get investigators on the ground in Gaza for obvious reasons, it's war. But they will be working in the background. I generally believe, it might seem impossible now, I generally believe that those perpetrators, alleged perpetrators, are able to be caught and can be brought to trial, but it will take time and political will. Okay. It's complicated in Gaza because of the reaction of America and others are not acknowledging it, but it is possible, and I hope that we can support the ICC and enable this to take place going down forward.
Okay. Tucker, thank you very, very much for that interview. I'm sorry that we don't have more time to get into what is an absolutely fascinating issue, but we're very grateful for you for joining us for In Conversation. But for now, that's it.
Thank you, John, very much.